Well, again, my name is Jothsna Harris, and I'm the Director of Community Engagement at Climate Generation, a Will Steger Legacy. And I'm also a climate reality leader trained in Denver in 2017. As you have heard, or maybe you attended the 2019 Minneapolis training, I was able to do a main stage presentation on climate storytelling, which I believe some of you helped out with as mentors. So thank you for helping with that. And then I was also able to join the virtual training doing an on-demand session with my colleague, Kira Liu, on climate storytelling, and that will be available during the 3 spring/summer sessions for the virtual trainings. And I'm glad to be here with you tonight, kind of doing a mini version of the power of climate storytelling and why we should all be using our personal stories of climate change as a way to advocate for solutions that's really relatable and personable. So I'm joining you tonight from my home in Woodbury, Minnesota, which is located on the ancestral and contemporary lands of the Dakota and Anishinaabe people. And I would love for you all to introduce yourself in the chat. So if you could share your name, what neighborhood you're joining from, and if you also know the native lands that you are on, you can share that as well. And then I'm getting some feedback, so if you could maybe mute your mics, that might be helpful.
Thanks for saying that, Josh. And I was just going to ask everybody to please mute their mics. So thank you.
Great. Well, I thought I would share a little bit about myself first before I get into a little bit about storytelling. So this is a picture of my dad at his first house here in Minnesota, and then my sister and myself with him when we were very little. I am first generation American, and my dad came to Minnesota in the 1960s to work for a company called 3M because it was part of his American dream. And in the early days, he would write letters back to our family in India to tell them what seemed like tall tales of our Minnesota winters. And growing up, our family would visit India. And growing up here, it felt like I was part of two very different worlds that were in stark contrast to each other. But the world is really a different place than it was 30 years ago. And the imprint of climate change is all around us, from the extreme heat and water shortages in India to our warming winters here in Minnesota that are impacting really everything, our ecosystems, health, economy, and traditions. And we know that climate change is interconnected. It's very intersectional and connected with racial injustice and health disparities. And really, in this time of pandemic, it has reminded me that the world is not as big as it sometimes seems, and that our stories are all connected. I read a recent Time magazine article that was making the connection in India's worsening COVID-19 crisis, that polluted air makes people more vulnerable to COVID-19. And that's not so different too from the communities here in the US and in areas of Minneapolis where we have seen really being hit first and worst, not only by the pandemic, but the impacts of climate change and racial injustice, communities of color and low income people. So the future that I imagine is a better world for my family where everyone can be healthy and thriving. And my daughter, who is 16 years old, is now with my dad tonight, and he's 75 years old now. But I think about them when I'm thinking about why I do this work, because I want to see that world for both of them. So if you don't know who Climate Generation is, we are a nonprofit. We're located in Minneapolis, but we do work nationally and internationally as well. And we are completely dedicated to engaging people in solutions to climate change. And at the core of Climate Generation's work is the power of personal narrative. We were founded by Will Steger, who is a polar explorer, an educator, and a climate change advocate. And for over 50 years, Will has inspired tens of thousands of people through his remarkable accounts of climate change in our polar regions. And he has been witness to the disintegration of some of the world's major ice shelves, all which occurred more rapidly than any of the scientific models could have projected, um, and something that Will never imagined would happen during his lifetime at all. And of course, we all know that the melting polar ice caps are not a standalone story, but an indicator of the rapidly changing climate that we are all facing, with ripple effects impacting coastal communities around the world, as well as other repercussions. So Will shared his story as a vehicle, not only to engage people and enthrall them with Arctic adventures and chronicles of crossing Antarctica via dog sled, but also really to educate people about climate change and then to inspire them to take action. And we know that personal stories are a really powerful way to engage people on climate change. And now, with the imprint of climate change all around us, it's really not just a few people like Will who can tell these really personal and powerful stories. It's become increasingly clear that we are all eyewitnesses to climate change and that we all have powerful stories to tell. So, talking about climate change, we know according to Yale's climate opinion polling, um, that still not a lot of people are talking about climate change as many people as I would wish were. Polling shows that nearly 70% of Americans understand that climate change is happening and that it will cause harm to future generations. Yet, two-thirds of Americans say that they never talk about it. So we know that there's a disconnect between people feeling concerned but lacking confidence. So, one of the most important things that we can do to address climate change is to talk about it. It is a really tangible way that we can all get involved in to normalize conversations about climate change. Because, after all, we know that public opinion drives decision making. And so, talking about climate change is really important. And I'm sure that all of you have experienced in your lives difficulty talking about climate change with certain circles. And so I, it would be fun to actually generate a list of ways that have been challenging to talk about climate change. But I'm going to just list off a few ways that I have found it has been challenging. And if you find that you agree with these, you can feel free to do the thumbs up emoji um, to show your agreement. But the reality of climate change is just daunting, and understanding the data, the trends, the impacts, and the solutions can feel really overwhelming. That's one of the reasons I have found it's been hard to talk about climate change. Um, Most of us are not climate scientists, so it can be difficult to feel like you have all the facts and the data and credentials to make a compelling case. I would imagine that we do have some scientists on this call, so that is great to have also. And then to add to this, we are currently in an era of misinformation and disinformation about climate change, as well as a lot of other things. But unfortunately, climate change and even the science has become politicized. And then, to be honest, many of us have not talked about climate change because there is a real concern or even a fear that we won't be received, we won't be effective, or that we might even ruin a relationship. So, if you have felt yourself in any of those areas I named, finding difficulty of your own talking with certain people about climate change, you can feel free to give a thumbs up. But the combination of these reasons and more make talking about climate change in meaningful ways very complicated at times. So, we know that opinions on climate change go far beyond just agreeing on the causes and the consequences, right? Because fundamentally, our beliefs and our behaviors stem from our unique identity, our worldview, and our value systems. So, in order to have effective conversations, we actually need to reframe the way that we discuss climate change. We need to have conversations that help us find our shared values and then build from there. So, how do we do that? Well, for a long time, the way that we have talked about climate change in mainstream communications has been mostly from a scientific perspective alone. And we all know that the science is absolutely essential to make the case. But it's not the whole picture because it's actually our stories, our humanity that places those facts and figures into context to make meaning for our lives. So, research tells us also that information alone is not enough to move people to change their behaviors. If it had been, we would have hopefully have gotten a lot further on climate change than we are at right now. More than 20 years ago, the famous neuroscientist Antonio Damasio pointed out that information only becomes meaningful to the extent that it evokes emotion. So, connecting the head and the heart on climate change is essential for sparking and sustaining action. And that is why talking about our personal stories is a great way to balance the science. We also know that climate change is emotional. And I don't think I need to tell you this, but there's a whole spectrum of emotions that we feel when we're learning about and dealing with climate change, right? We have feelings about loss and despair, hope and resolve. It might flip back and forth depending on the day and how we're feeling or the news that we hear or the small victories that we might feel we've achieved, or it could change. But if we're being honest, I would imagine that many of us, if not all of us here today, have felt some level of grief about climate change. I know that I have. And according to the American Psychological Association, the traumas that are associated with climate change impacts can have an enormous effect on our mental, social, and spiritual well being, and sometimes at an even greater intensity and longer lasting than physical impacts. Yet it is possible that the grief that we feel can also serve as a transformational catalyst to galvanize us. And even in the process of finding your climate story, there can be sort of a therapy through reflection and writing. It can prompt a path to healing. Even just acknowledging the emotions that we feel and to name them can be helpful. And then sharing our stories with others can also be a really validating and empowering experience. By sharing stories, we can build connections with other people in an authentic way, gain confidence talking about climate change, and also use that as a tool to advocate for various types of solutions. So, what is a climate story? A climate story is really about your own unique identity as a person and also about your experience of climate change. So it's a personal story about you and your experience of climate change. It could include observations that you've had over your lifetime. It could include a pivotal moment, maybe impact or loss, or solutions or hope. It could simply be why you care about climate change. It is a story that is descriptive, personal, and makes an emotional connection to the issue. And then, interestingly, the more detailed your story is, the more you can paint that picture in a sensory way and bring people into it, the more universally resonant it becomes. And research on brain to brain coupling has shown that when we describe our experiences vividly for others, the listener's brain lights up alongside ours as though we had all experienced the same events. So I'd like you, if you haven't thought about it, to consider discovering your own climate story if you haven't already. And so I'm going to paste a link in the chat with some sample writing prompts that can help you reflect and write your climate story. And then you can submit your story to our online storytelling collection at Climate Generation, which features climate stories from people all around the world. So I am going to see if I can figure out how to paste this. I might have to stop sharing. I'll paste it afterwards. Um, and then I have a sample climate story, and I realize that I have enough time to share it with you. So I'm going to stop sharing my presentation and I'm going to move over to the video. Just one moment. All right, hopefully you can see Bob Blake. I'm going to play his video.
I'm Bob Blake from Red Lake. I'm from the Red Lake Tribal Nation, and uncle, brother, son, friend, co-worker, global citizen. I first heard about climate change about 10 or 12 years ago, and didn't think too much about it then. And then, my brother got sick, and he needed a new heart, and he was a police officer here in Minneapolis, and he had children, and he passed away. But before he passed away, he asked me to get his kids through college, and he said to walk his daughters down the aisle is what he asked me to do. There was this unbelievable this desire to want to make this world better for them. I had no idea how to be a parent. And then all of a sudden I was like this surrogate father to like these kids, and they're all looking at me for direction. And then I was like, I have to do something. And I was already aware of climate change, but wasn't really, taking action. I really thought that this was something that was too big. It was just something too complex, and I couldn't do anything about it. I'm just one person. And then something about being the surrogate father to these kids just made me feel like I could take on the world. That is really when I decided to take action. I created a business plan at MCTC in one of my business management classes on a solar company called Solar Bear. Solar Bear's native name is Gizisa Makwa. And Gizis means sun, Makwa means bear. There's a lot of creation stories from Native people from the sun. So the Gizis, the sun, plays a really huge role in our cultural teachings. And Makwa, bear, is my mother's clan. So I wanted to pay respect to my mother. And we don't have a name for solar in Ojibwe, but we do have for sun, and so that's the proper pronunciation for it. And I'm trying to look back at like trying to maybe see the way that my ancestors have lived, and the way that maybe they have dealt with insurmountable obstacles. It's only really because of them like I'm here, right? Because they were faced with like genocide, and because they figured out a way to live, I'm even here. So I think that's what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to figure out a way for the next generation. One of the things that really struck me when we got done installing the job in Red Lake was a couple of the guys came up to me and said, Bob, I really feel good about this. This is not only helping our community, this is helping the environment. I've really enjoyed doing this job. And that made me feel so good because I'm up there and I'm looking around on the roof, and I'm looking at like 13, 14 of like my fellow native Red Lake brothers, like installing solar with them. There was no bigger pride I could have than to see that. I've been able to take the knowledge that I have learned from doing solar, and I was able to participate in a training session in Bismarck, North Dakota, with tribes from all over North and South Dakota. Everybody was coming up to me, and they're like, we want to hear about Solar Bear. It was unbelievable the way, people were talking about Solar Bear as if he was his own person. I saw that hope in people's eyes, and Native people, and they were so proud. And I was like, I want you guys to have your own Solar Bear. I want you guys to create your own your own companies, and do the same thing that I'm doing in your own communities. Energy sovereignty is so important to tribal communities and their health, and because this is also a wealth building asset. That money is going back into our community, creating jobs, creating opportunities for the community. And that's why renewable energy is such a game changer and such a disruptive technology, because it's allowing communities to do this now that it has never been done before. We have this thing, climate change. We have this opportunity of people, of Native people really owning it. The society right now is looking for direction. Okay, we have it. We're the only people that has a government with inside this government. Let's use that. That's power. What better way than to save the planet? It's the only one we got. Son,
Well, I just love Bob. He's got such an infectious charisma about him. I just can't help but feeling excited about the future that he envisions. And I don't know if you felt yourself as he was telling his story, feeling different emotions, but he kind of did this story in one take, and he's a natural kind of storyteller, and he's got a great story to tell. So and I would encourage you, if you are thinking, I don't have a story, or maybe I have a story, but my voice is not powerful enough. I assure you that we all have stories and your voice is powerful. So I would invite you to kind of dig into that and think about what your story might be, and maybe take some time to write on it as well. Okay, so I think I'm sharing my screen. Do you see what is the climate story? Okay, good.
Yes, we do.
Great. So I'm almost done with my presentation. I know we'll have some time to have a conversation as well. But one of the most important things is, once you do identify what your climate story is and you feel like you can articulate it, it's really sharing it. It's sharing your story with friends, family, neighbors, policymakers, really everyone. You can share it in climate reality presentations to advocate for specific solutions. And I have found in it when working with people, it's really in that practice of sharing it and making mistakes and making it better, refining it, doing it again, is the part that really builds confidence and helps you to feel like you own your story. And I have also heard from people that it is a really helpful way to begin conversations about climate change, especially when you're not sure how you will be received and you're a little bit nervous about it, because it's much harder for somebody to dispute your own personal experience and your story, um, as it is, unfortunately, talking about the data and the science. Um, but your story is like an entry point for you to build a connection with somebody, and to ask them questions about what they think. And then there's the point that can come along where they're interested in hearing more about it, where you can share the science and the facts and the data, which help to just reinforce everything. So it's not that stories are more important than the science, but it's a good way to reinforce the science. And then one kind of demonstration of how climate generation has been helping to amplify people's stories is that we recently published a book called Eyewitness: Minnesota Voices on Climate Change, which is a community sourced collection of stories, poetry, and art submitted by people all across the state, including some prominent voices like I see Lee Freilich on the call here tonight, who is in Eyewitness, and as well as Mark Seeley and many other people. But it's really a collective testimony of climate change in Minnesota. Um, And at the beginning of this legislative session, we sent a copy of Eyewitness to every Minnesota policymaker so that they could see this as a piece of literary activism. And then they were invited to a kind of storytelling style hearing where they could hear live testimony and stories and music and see people's artwork to demonstrate that. And really for them to hear that Minnesotans care about climate change and we are demanding bold action and as a way to move climate legislation. And then finally, we'd love for you to stay engaged with Climate Generation. We do lots of other things besides helping people to find their climate stories, including providing curriculum for K through 12 educators and helping teachers bring climate change into the classroom across every subject area. And we also work with high school age youth to help them really find their own leadership and to advocate for solutions at various levels. So these are ways you can stay connected with us. And that's the end of my presentation. So I think we'll open it up for conversation now.
Jothsna, that was awesome. Thank you very much. And yes, we do have a couple of minutes. And one question, are you able to stay a little past 7:30? Great. So if we'll have a couple of minutes now and want to make sure we allot enough time for Hobie. And then if we want to re-engage after the official end of the meeting at 7:30, we keep this Zoom chat going for a period of time. So I'll open up the floor to anybody who wants to ask a question or comment.
I just want to thank you for sharing the story on Solar Bear. And what an amazing Minnesotan person. So thank you. Thank you for your whole presentation, actually. Thank you.
Oh, good. I'm glad you enjoyed it. You definitely check out Solar Bear.
Hi, Jothsna. My name is Brick Field. I live in Bemidji, Minnesota, and thank you for your presentation.
Hi,
I wanted to ask you a question about whether or not you would consider or recommend framing your personal climate story, pending the type of audience or even an individual, and their to be in context of, for example, if I wanted to do share my climate story with our local representative, Pete Stauber, who has demonstrated quite a bit that he's not very motivated by even the science of climate science. How would one go about framing their own personal story to be able to approach or reach out to audiences where you think they are potentially disregarding the science in general, and you may not feel like you're going to be effective in trying to reach them on a personal level?
that's an excellent question. And I just want to say, I definitely don't know all of the answers. And I think there's probably people on this call that could say a lot more about that. But two things popped into my mind. One, I think almost everything good comes from being in good relationship. And so if you can develop a good relationship, aside from talking about climate change, I have found that just as intuitive people, it can be helpful to invite a conversation to get to know them a little bit better and see what they're interested in, because you might be able to hear more about what they care about, what their values are. And most of us know that climate change is connected to everything. And so you can bring climate change into that. And maybe it's a series of conversations and not all at once. So you can go back and process what you learned from that conversation. But I have found that a layering process works really well. And so even beginning with, hey, do you have time for a quick conversation? I'm curious to know, what do you think about climate change? And then just listen. And even if the other person says something that you really want to dispute or, you know, kind of makes you want to rise up and and just spew out all the things you know, I found it that it's best to listen and repeat what that person said, what you heard that person say, and just validate what they are talking about. Because I think at the end of the day, we all want to be heard and understood. And if they feel that, you kind of build that reciprocity and trust. And then the natural thing would be for them to ask you, well, tell me what you think. And then that's a good entry point to then bring in your climate story, because a climate story bends the ear in a different way and invites people to also listen. And then when you kind of go a little further, bringing in the climate facts and the science, and saying, hey, I'm going to be part of this solution on Saturday. I'd love for you to join me. Or, it's kind of
Mhm.
like any relationship we build, right? So I found that that can be helpful. The other thing that popped into my mind is just knowing the pure, statistics about who climate deniers are. A very narrow slice of the population, very, very narrow. And it
Mhm.
doesn't feel like that oftentimes because they're very loud. Um, but that simply means that we need to raise the din and to continue to talk about climate change and to continue to show that we care about this and that it's important. So I sometimes remember, it's really not as many people as it feels like sometimes. And when I don't, you all have probably maybe heard of the Yale Six Americas study, which shows the six American opinions on climate change, kind of the six camps. Really, the largest camp is the people who are concerned about climate change, but they're not yet active. And so that's the largest camp of people, the movable middle. And that's really the people in my mind that are ready. They're ready to be engaged. They're ready to move. They just need that next kind of tangible next thing to work on. And that's encouraging to me that there are people who are ready.
I had a question for Jothsna regarding telling our stories in climate change. Do you see any complication in saying a story that's personal about your observation of the natural world around you that could encroach on pushback, or that could invite pushback of the sort, well, you just talked about weather, that's not climate? Like if I say, oh, the lilacs are coming in earlier or later or not coming in at all or whatever, somebody could counter with that's not climate, that's weather, or some kind of rational scientific argument. How do you frame your story to avoid that sort of thing?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, I think so that your story is more than like a case study. It is a narrative. And so it will read like that, and people will hear it like that. But one thing that can be really helpful when you're weaving your story together is to reinforce it with climate facts. So if you make statements in your story about, um, for example, if you're a winter enthusiast and you have experienced the love and loss of winter, you can reinforce that with a climate fact about Minnesota winters and how they're being impacted by climate change. And so I think it is helpful if you can have somebody kind of look over your story and provide feedback and editing so that it is really compelling to draw people in, so they don't only hear the pieces that they could dispute, but they hear the parts that demonstrate vulnerability, and those are the pieces that connect other people. And so those are some ideas that I have about that.
On a personal note, I had incorporated just my own history of winter into my climate presentation after the 2019 training. And I did a training for it was mostly men's organization, and there were a lot of naysayers. And I really think the fact I talked about my dad, and I had photos kind of like you did at the beginning of yours, Jothsna, that showing my dad would make a skating rink in our backyard. And I was probably 3 years old holding his hand. And there's no way you can really keep a skating rink anymore in your backyard. And I had a picture of us sliding off the roof of our house. I can't believe that they let us do that into these big piles of snow. And by the end of it, I mean, I'm sure that I didn't change everyone's mind, but a lot of people came up and thanked me and said it was eye-opening. And I actually think it was like I was a real person then, instead of somebody just standing there telling them facts and showing them all the horrors of climate, all the, Al Gore's pictures. I mean, it would terrify everyone. And so I think having a photo really does of something that connects, that's important to you, maybe does change people's mind, or at least opens their mind.
Yeah, and I know that not everybody can make a really polished video like Bob Blake had, but I know a lot of people are making shorter selfie videos of their climate story and using them to post on social media or share in different places. And that has also been a really influential way for people to see your humanity and connect with you as a person, like you were saying, Cheryl, for them to see kind of a glimpse into your world. And it does jog your own memory about your own experiences too. It's kind of remarkable how that can happen. I remember hearing a story from a woman in where was she now? St. Cloud area, and she talked about her love for pond hockey, and over the years how she had to dabble in making her own ice because the ice wasn't keeping long enough for her to really have good quality ice. But she described in such vivid detail what it was like for her to skate on good quality ice, the feeling of it, and how she would stay out all night. And um, she was very technical about how she described that. And I have only stepped onto a frozen lake, even though I've lived in Minnesota my entire life, maybe once. I know I should definitely do that more. But even though I couldn't relate at all to what she was talking about, I definitely could see her love um, for the sport and how she was describing with such enthusiasm and the loss of that I felt when she described it. I felt that too. So I think it is like practicing, how do you draw somebody in and make them feel what you have felt. There's like a beauty to that.